Hello, everybody. My dog is drinking in the background. Give him a moment. Perfect timing. Anyway, I did an expression session. He may drink forever, so we can't wait for him. Okay. I did an expression session and I uploaded it, but the volume, so I have my new earbuds, and they're great for listening to music, like when I'm working out or doing something, and they're good for meetings sometimes, but not for videos on YouTube. So apparently when I do videos in Zoom like this, well, there's two good things that I think that come with doing them in Zoom. One is I can pull the map up or anything else. And the other thing is the volume, I think, might be better, but you guys can let me know if you feel like commenting. Anyway, there were some things in the expression session that I really wanted to say, so I just want to do a video and say those things. Oh yeah, first question. Someone asked, Scott, if you were doing your spiritual path over again, or if you were to advise someone from the beginning, how exactly would you do it differently, or would you advise someone? And here, this is the best way to explain it. You may have to maximize your screen if you're watching this, here on YouTube. Make your screen as big as you can on your device or your computer, so that when I zoom in like this, you can see the words really clearly. But when we first start out in awareness-based, presence-based practices, that's also meditation, mindfulness, non-dual teachings, all that. The issue is that we don't prompt anything up from the beginning. So we think that the instruction to just be and to see is enough. And it is to a certain degree. But it's really not in the end when it comes to like the embodiment of presence. It's not at all, in my view. And I think this is the reason why so many people have been attracted to these teachings through the centuries. But how many people, it's still somewhat rare that someone is first having that awakening with that real shift into presence. But even more than that, the embodiment of that, because of the need for safety, let me say that first, the need for safety. So when I talk about starting, if you're going to start your spiritual practice now, I would say, this is what I would say from the beginning, is understand from a trauma-informed perspective that fear, you could say, or the need for safety, survival, is running everything in the nervous system. So you want to be aware of that from the beginning, because when you come to the awareness-based teachings, when you start to be a seeker or someone who's in the process of healing through presence-based work, you want to be aware of these things from the beginning, that this need for safety ends up showing up as things that are difficult to investigate from first dimension awareness, from just being, resting awareness, mindfulness, meditation. Resting as awareness, mindfulness, meditation. And I hope I've made that clear in previous videos. I am encouraging everyone to at least now watch, for example, anyone who's stumbling upon this video right now, who's seeing this map for the first time, I actually encourage you to go watch, before this video, to go watch the video, the KI map introduction and overview. It's on YouTube. Before you watch this, because this is, okay, so the overview gives you an overview. Here's a specific question, and the questions can be, the map can be used for practice. You're going to see, and people are seeing it in the members area, it's very experiential map because it shows you how your system is seeking safety. Therefore, over time, that looks like a bypass. How do you start the practice in a way that doesn't just end up being a long bypass? It's real simple to me, actually, is that if you see this fear shows up as these issues, these red line issues here, and that these issues are driven by trauma and repression. If you understand that fully, if that's not something new to you, if that's just something that you learn from the beginning, or you're trauma informed, or you make yourself trauma informed, and you really, really know that that's really what's going on, then you can cut out a lot of time, in my view, and mind stuff, and just go straight to not only resting as awareness or first dimension practice, like definitely when you start, that really needs to be included. So as much as I criticize my own teaching prior to 2016, and it's the limitation of it, even though there's great benefit to non-dual pointing in first dimension, from the beginning, I didn't know these things. So there's a lot of benefit, but the limitation is big. And that is that the roots of these issues are down here in the body. Okay. And knowing that from the beginning, you can start a practice that then includes third dimension work as soon as you can. Somebody asked me the question, that's my answer. As soon as you possibly can, start third dimension work. For anybody, in my view, anybody in spirituality, something close to third dimension work as soon as you can. I'll qualify and explain that in a second. I'm just going to keep the map up and take my video down because there's no reason for you to see me. I just want you to see the map. The map is what's important and the work is what's important. So let's go focus in on this first dimension. So I would do it differently. The easiest way to say this, or the simplest way to say this, is I would start with all three dimensions in my experience. I wouldn't wait to learn about the other dimensions. If I know that fear runs the show and the need for safety and survival and are running the show from the beginning, and that my nervous system seeks safety, and that over time that looks like a bypass, and over time the issues that come from that are these issues here, the red line. If I know that from the beginning, then I want it all three dimensions as quickly as I can. Now, let me qualify that. I'm sorry, I'm munching now on some pre-dinner snack. From the beginning, as quickly as you can. I don't mean it's like a rush to that. It's not that. It's just that you want to include it as quickly as you can because it's the source of the stuff you're seeing up here. So in other words, if you start in first dimension, resting as awareness, and you see shadows are repressed or suppressed aspects of yourself, again, that are too ugly or too beautiful. And so they're disowned. They literally are repressed and suppressed. And so the energy that you have around other people who have certain traits or emotions, that's your shadow. That's an aspect of yourself. It really looks like other, but in the ultimate sense, there is no other. There's no separation in the ultimate sense. So that's actually you. And so, but you can't see it in first dimension. You can't see the root of it. See, because I said repression or suppression, this is down here. This repression mechanism is hidden in the body. It doesn't show up when you see the shadows, when you experience shadows. So you wouldn't be able to get to the root of shadows, the actual root of shadows in first dimension pointing, because this is very deeply hidden trauma imprinting or programming. Very, very deep in the body. It's only as I went through the embodiment process, post-awakening, that I discovered that programming. It's not something that we discover when we first get here to these teachings or to these practices. It's not something that not even everybody discovers them. If you're not trauma informed, you wouldn't even go looking for that necessarily. So it's becoming trauma informed and also informed around the mind-body connection, which are two things that are not necessarily talked about a lot in spirituality. And that's the thing you want to remember when you're starting the path, is you might want to supplement what you're learning from the non-dual teachings or the traditions and the practices, supplement that with with information around trauma and repression, if I were you, I would bring the map in for yourself. Because here again, if you just go to the first dimension teaching or practice, these things are going to show up. You're just not going to know what the root of it is, including body contraction, chronic pain. These become serious issues for people. See? So why not start early? The bypass is to ignore that stuff or to just rest with it, not getting to the root of it. Bypass just means to like step around something, to make an end run around something. So if the fear is running the show and repression and trauma are at the root of most of the suffering, then the bypass would be to try to go around that, to make an end run around it, to not deal with it. And instead, again, to deal with just the effects of it, which would be the shadows that come out. But we also, again, we know from science that addictions are driven by repression and trauma. It's definitely what I saw in my treatment centers and in the science that I studied to have those treatment centers. And as we've discovered in KI, our triggers are directly related to trauma and repression. There's research on that too. So we are now in 2022, 23, and we know so much more about the human operating system and kind of how it works. And what's so beautiful to me is that the findings in the West, even though shadow material was dealt with before these Western discoveries, essentially the West is responsible for the discovery of emotional repression. Carl Jung, Freud, others, and then the trauma research that came, the science around the trauma that came the last 50 years, and shadow work and shadows. That's a Western, in a sense, a Western discovery. So the West discovered the unconscious. The West discovered, or at least pointed us to this. And even though some of the ancient traditions went very deep, so I was talking to my friend Mihai about this. Okay, I'm going to talk about that in a second. The older traditions that I think very probably do go into some of this. Actually, I think there are some traditions that do it, but they don't use the same language, so it's hard to understand whether they're talking about programming that's really unconscious. But anyway, most of the traditions, apart from those that I was just talking about, don't dig into that at all. And so what we've learned from the West, though, is that's what's running things, see? And the map shows that, and we've seen it in KI, that repression and trauma is running all this suffering. These are the effects of it here in first dimension that we're seeing. Again, I feel like that's a Western discovery. The Eastern practices and teachings, you can't generalize too much about them, but you can say that they're generally focused at the highest level at the seeing of no self. You know, the mystic traditions of the various religions kind of agree that at the core of the experience, there is no self. That's perennial philosophy. And the traditions also generally, the Eastern traditions generally don't necessarily use inquiry. There is some of that in there, but the meditation is a big practice from those traditions. And meditation generally does not prompt things up. Some forms of meditation do. Generally, it's like the calm abidance, or letting things be as they are, or mindfulness, attending to what's arising in the moment. You see, there's just no prompting. And I want you guys to hear that. If we're talking about the beginning of practice, we might be drawn, especially after years of processing. So here's the thing. Many of us come to the non-dual or the presence work after years of processing. But I have to say that maybe the processing we were doing wasn't getting to the root issues. And so we weren't really healing. You see, and some of us were really seeking, but not getting to the root issues when we were trying to process from the separate self paradigm, you know, like the real belief that I'm this story and that I'm broken and I've got to fix myself, really believing all that. We become drawn to the non-dual teachings, especially the first dimension teachings and practices, because they offer that promise of like, you don't really have to, a lot of them do, not all of them. The modern teachings more kind of offer the promise of, hey, it's already here. You don't have to clear anything out of the body. We're just going to point to what's already here, right? So what I say is when you're starting to practice, involve yourself with those teachings and practices. See that, I want you to hear that part of it. Even though I turn a critical eye on that dimension, I only do that because of its limitation. There's great benefit in just sitting with a teacher or in a practice that's very skillful around just being and recognizing the presence that's already here. So nothing that I'm saying is saying dismiss those teachings or those traditions. Please understand that this is more of like an integral model. It includes everything. It doesn't dismiss previous dimensions or anything. It does not do that. It includes them all. And I'll explain more, hopefully, as this map stays in our consciousness and KI stays in your consciousness. I'll explain that more. I think it'll become more obvious. But so if you're just starting out, these practices on the right here in the first dimension, are to me still recommended. Fully recommended, actually, if you care. Well, somebody asked me, so I'm telling you. Yes, use all of them. Use the ones that resonate the most, whether it's KI or something else. I often say, is again, as much as I turn a critical eye on some of the teachings out there that do not understand the limitations of that style of pointing or practice, I still endorse and hold up a lot of those teachings and practices because of their value. I could name names of great teachers. I could name traditions that are very skillful. Dzogchen is one of my favorite. First dimension, because it's really about allowing everything to be as it is. And in that way, it's not suppressive. It doesn't suppress. It doesn't tend towards that, but it can reinforce what's already there. So any of these first dimension teachings or practices, if there isn't any inquiry or something that gets below the surface, as it's like lift the hood up to see what's there. If they don't do that at all, that's a problem, potentially, because we now know that there's a bypass. There's even been the studying of the monks that over decades, they miss their anger, repression, their shadows. There's real suffering behind that. Repression. So as they miss that experience, they experience that suffering and that bypassing over decades and decades of meditation. What does that tell you about first dimension? Because many of these monks probably had deep states of realization in meditation, and that should not be discounted. So that's what I'm saying. When you come to these teachings, you want to include that first dimension, because there are deep states of realization available. That's what the whole purpose of the non-dual practice or teaching is to show, to point to that for people. So can you hear that first before we go deeper into the question of it's not enough? Okay, so there's great benefit first. Okay, but now that we see the red lines, we start to see, okay, those red lines are connected to a very basic fear or need for safety around a lot of different things. But here we want to talk about the need for safety around emotions and in relationship and repression, you could say. So this fear that we're talking about, or how the nervous system operates from that or within that emotion, flooding the body with fear as a way for you to respond to something and take some action, right? So understanding that from a trauma-informed perspective, then hopefully you'll start to see that the first dimension practices or teachings are not enough in the beginning, not to get to the root of the things on the red lines. This is the bypassing that I saw as a teacher. So for so many years, remember, I was a bit different of a teacher. Instead of doing a lot of groups, I did a lot of groups, but I spent most of my time in one-on-one sessions with people all over the world who had been exposed to these Eastern practices. I saw the bypassing happening year after year, day after day after day around these issues. So you're probably experiencing something like that. What I'm saying to people who are starting the path is include the second dimension right away, at the very least, and include shadow work right away. So this is what the beginning of your path would look like. At the very least, these two dimensions, if you're asking me. Because if you look at the second dimension, we start to get into the body as you prompt things up through somatic-based inquiry, like mining, for example, where you feel into the inner body where you might be holding energy and you say, what does this mean about me? Or what would this energy say if it had a voice? Then the mind comes up because there's a mind-body connection with that energy, but the mind was hiding in it, see? So things hide in the body, and we start to see or experience that more with second dimension because that stuff is hiding in first dimension. If you don't prompt it up, it doesn't come up. It's like programming that's running things kind of behind the scenes in the body. And there's a mind-body connection with it. It's just unconscious. Some programming, in fact, quite a lot, is unconscious. And so there in second dimension, we can also start to see, again, these deficiency stories and core identities, self-limiting beliefs. Now, here's the thing, though. We see some of that in first dimension. You're sitting in meditation and you hear the thoughts like, I'm not good enough. Things that just appear without prompting anything up. You might even hear a lot of those if you're a really skillful meditator and you know how to go to different places. But when we're really using meditation or mindfulness in a way that just cultivates just the recognition of presence without exploring certain unconscious things in that, that's where the bypassing can happen. So I'm going to take you back to the map. But here we're talking about that second dimension where the identity of the deficiency story or the sort of the core aspect of ego. By deficiency, I mean I'm unlovable. There's something wrong with me. I'm unsafe. It's an identity. Identity. It's like the label that you place on yourself, and you feel it deeply. You feel it deeply, especially when triggered. And there's a me feeling to that. It's not just thoughts. So in second dimension, you feel into the body and you prompt those thoughts up, like I said, and you start to see more of that identity. And that, of course, helps you see that that's a childhood script. It's very painful, but you really start to see that's not me. It's coming and going to be me being the awareness that sees and allows it. It's awake to it. So you know all this, but the reason I got back on the camera is to show you this. Is it, well, let's look back at the map once more and then I'll come back. Look, when we're triggered, for example, the repression that's hiding in the unconscious is right behind the trigger, or you could say right behind the identity that kind of shows up more consciously in the trigger. That I'm not good enough, or that I'm unlovable, that, or I'm a victim, that shows up that I just showed you, that kind of just rears its head in somatic inquiry. Well, the roots of that are here. And I'm going to show it to you in a second, in a way. But I want you to see it on the map, see, because the stuff in the third dimension is hiding, right? That's what the map shows. And we start to see, again, really sometimes for the first time, we start to see the core programming of the ego, you know, unlovable, not good enough, right there in second dimension. So you want to start that early because that ego identity is there in your triggers, even in first dimension. That's your identity from childhood, core aspect of it. So when you're meditating, that identity, remember, it's tied to trauma and repression. So it's not going to arise easily. It's programming that's kind of protecting you, as you'll see. Remember, it's all about safety. It's not who you are, but it hides. See, so when you're meditating and just resting, that identity and all of its programming doesn't want to just come up and be seen. And so if you see something coming up like a memory, just coming naturally in meditation, you might hear the story or feel those feelings for a bit. But in a sense, that's just because it sort of like randomly happened. You know what I mean? Like you didn't prompt it up. It just happened to arise. So there's much more to that programming though. So in first dimension, you see just bits of it and you miss some of it and sometimes a lot of it. So prompting it up, not just through mining, but like once you know what that story is, if you say like, okay, the opposite, I'm lovable. If that's the opposite of unlovable, I'm lovable. And then just watch these other aspects of the programming be prompted up then. So they're coming above the line into awareness. These other stories, words, connected with that identity. You see how that's still unconscious because you have to prompt it up. If you don't say the reverse, for example, in a trigger or something to prompt up the identity, remember that the research says that in a trigger, for example, the identity, what they really say, the programming, the memories, the past doesn't appear. So you're just seeing something happen in your present experience and there's a reaction, right? Remember that there's an identity there from childhood that's self-protecting. There's the ego, but it hides a lot. So if you think about your triggers differently now, knowing that the identity itself hides and you have to kind of prompt it up, but behind that, there's unconscious trauma programming and repression behind it. That's what's going on. That's why those triggers are so powerful. There's that much there. And we don't go deep enough, I think, in spirituality for this reason right here. We don't see that the trigger or the identity itself has behind it, kind of back here, the repression conditioning, the self-protective need for safety around emotions, around the primary repression. That kind of repression conditioning, trauma is back here. So the trigger is very deceptive because we feel safer emotions, remember, in triggers. We don't feel the repression. That's the purpose of the repression, is to protect us. That programming protects us from that emotion or those emotions so that we're not flooded with it and re-traumatized every time we're triggered in a way. This has been protecting us since childhood, but it's also the source of suffering. We know that now. So it's not relevant anymore. The programming that's self-protecting around emotions, it was relevant and helpful in childhood. Now it's a source of suffering. So, but if we remain afraid of it, see, it has fear. We're already afraid of these feelings, this repression, these repressed emotions. But if we remain where we're not going to investigate that fear and open to those emotions, then this will remain. So our triggers and our identities will always have this with it. And I was explaining the other day that in my own path, so I want you to see it experientially, not just as a theory. But I think you'll relate to this in some way. The identity, the negative identities that I was experiencing, I'm unlovable in my real suffering days. Again, there was some anger in that, but it was mostly woundedness and victim and like, feel sorry for me. That's hurtful. Woundedness, maybe fear, some shame, but not really a lot of anger because the anger was behind it. And the system was self-protecting around that emotion. So the identity of unlovable, even though it was very painful, it felt safer than that anger to this nervous system that's run on safety. So those are my negative identities. That the repression was right there. So to the extent that those triggers remain, and they did for a while after the awakening, the deficiency story trigger, to the extent that that continued, it's because that there was this unprocessed trauma and repression behind it. Strangely, though, there's this, I want to say this real quick, you can still bypass at that level, even as you start to see the emptiness of that identity that's showing up. Because repression and trauma is the core programming. And it might not even really be touched in some way for some people if you're not going to go into the unconscious, see? So it's untouched, and we now know that that can be creating disease or illness or chronic pain because we're not reaching those areas. Or it can for any human, but here in spirituality, if we're literally bypassing those areas that create pain, illness, mental health, then we're doing something that is not healthy for us with spirituality. So start as soon as you can with first and second dimension. It doesn't even have to be KI. Let's, for example, say you don't like KI or you don't like me or something, but still you could use the map, because I think it applies. It's the bypassing. Yeah, you could just say, okay, forget. Well, so KI is the only third dimension that I know. Here's what I mean by third dimension before we go to how you start the path. Because I want you to understand this, because some people will be confused into thinking that there's a lot of things out there that are third dimension. So it's a specific thing, third dimension. First dimension is when just resting or being, seeing, noticing, not prompting anything up. Still witnessing, if anything, just seeing, right? Allowing. Second dimension is prompting things up that wouldn't otherwise arise, and then witnessing, seeing, allowing. And it's all first and second is horizontal, remember. So you're seeing one thing after the other, like in a series, and that's important. Follow me? That's first and second dimension. So when you start practice, you're starting a horizontal practice first, if you want to think of it that way. These are just terms that you might not understand yet. You'll get used to them if you follow this work. Horizontal are the practices in first and second dimension. Look at the right side there. See that? So both are horizontal, meaning in first dimension, it's just natural when things arise, they arise one after the other to awareness. Horizontally, one after the other, like watching cars go by. And in second dimension, the only thing that's really different is that we're prompting things up. So we feel into the body and we say, what does this sensation mean? And then here come the cars, so to speak, into awareness going by now. Thoughts, words, pictures, one by one, horizontal. And that's important to explain third dimension, which is vertical. So any modality out there that is like that, I would think it would be third dimension. But what makes vertical vertical is that you're not focusing on a series of things. You're focusing on core programming that's embedded into the body, which can be very repetitive. In fact, the research refers to it as continuous trauma response. Continuous. So your repression of emotion doesn't take a break, right? You might be triggered in some ways from it more than other ways or different times, but the repression itself has to run constantly. I mean, think about it. You're not going to let your guard down around self-protection emotionally. You're not going to just, I'm going to take a break on Wednesdays, or like from 12 to 1, we're not going to have a repression mechanism. No, it's constant. So it's continuous. And it's not about a series of thoughts. There's that in there. I mean, there's suffering is there, things that come and go. But the real somatic suffering in the repression and trauma is more like repetitive response or continuous response. Fight, 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 flee, freeze, fawn. Or hold back anger, hold it back. But it actually looks like just quietness. But there's a trauma response, remember, going on continuously. This is our body. So understanding that, then a third dimension practice would have to take that into account. But there's a mind-body connection at a very unconscious level doing all that. And so a third dimension practice would have to make that conscious, which does not mean the effects of that conscious. And this is where all the confusion is, I think, around the difference between second and third dimension, or a lot of it is with third dimension, the programming is, again, it's powerful self-protective programming. It's not story, okay? It's not just memory. It's programming that protects you. So the effects of that would be the need for safety, right? The nervous system seeking safety. That's the effect of that. So I'm not talking about the effects that you see in first and second dimension. I'm not seeing the effects of the mind-body connection of repression, the shadows, those effects. Those are the effects. I'm not talking about the identity of self. That's an effect of it. So if you've investigated these effects, that is not the mind-body programming itself. And that's really important to hear that, so that we don't bamboozle ourselves here between second and third dimension because you remember, our system loves to do that. It loves to essentially just be really, really unconscious around this subject. And it fogs out even self-protection. Okay, so sorry, I'm jumping around there. But the effects are not what I'm talking about here. So even to the extent that big grief comes up or something, still not talking about that. That's what gets released. Even if it was repressed, there's some release of that. What I'm talking about is the programming itself, not the effects, not the emotions that are released. That can happen, but I'm talking about the programming itself. So any practice awareness-based that makes the mind-body connection in its true form in a way, which is a continuous response, making that conscious. And that's our rapid fire inquiry in third dimension. So it would have to be something like that that really makes that conscious in a way that transmutes energy, all layers of emotion, really transmutes that energy. It doesn't just soothe, make you feel better, more presence, more peace. No, we're transmuting energy. So that third dimension practice anywhere out there would have to have that. And I think a good skillful third dimension practice would also regulate the system. Because when you start messing with energies like that, if it gets too big, the system will just shut down. So the skills themselves have to be both safe and effective. And KI is, once it's skillful. Okay. So just going back again, I just want to show you that thing. I don't know if this helps you, but if you feel that, you're not going to know the thing back here. So remember, when you're triggered or identifying with some story or identity, that's what you're going to know. And you're going to know those emotions. You're not going to know the repressed or suppressed emotion. But that's going to be that programming that is holding that back for safety. That trauma imprinting is there behind, and it is the trigger. It's all the trigger. All the identity is that. And it's kind of just one thing. So, when we say, are we investigating? Are we just processing? Or are we just seeing that there's no self? Are we just resting as awareness? This is the selfing mechanism right here. This is it. The trauma response, the programming of that. So how do you divorce that from the separate self identity? How do you look at this movement, this trauma response of fight, flight, freeze, argue, defend, attack, run, hide, get angry, don't get angry, hold it back, all that. That's our human suffering, you guys. So how are we ever going to be able to, in good conscience, divorce the trauma talk from the awakening talk, if you really see that? And what is the use of an awakening if you're constantly just still getting triggered all the time or identifying with these things? That's why I say, like, real awakening, you wake up out of it. You don't just wake up and go, oh, I've got this operating system that is really, really painful. I'm suffering in it, but I'm seeing it. Yeah, you're seeing it. But once you're skillful, you're transmuting that. The energy's changing. You're not as identified with it. There's a shift happening. See? So we hope, I hope, that you will take this invitation that deeply in realization, like that deeply. But remember, your nervous system has a different agenda. And that's the thing I want to say to people who are just starting out. Your nervous system isn't interested in this. This is the last thing you want. You don't want to feel that. And that's where the bypassing comes from, right there. I don't want to feel that. And there's programming around that, literally in the body and mind. I don't want to feel it. I don't want to feel it. And it's continuous. And that's why you have body contraction, pain, all that stuff. It's the mind. It's not just body, mind. Hidden mind, though. Okay, so I'm going to leave the map up, talk about a couple of things here. Let's hold on a second. People have been asking, because of the map and because of KI, Scott, help me determine what my primary repression is. So remember when I say primary repression, see that written down there? It's important KI terminology, primary, and even sleeper repression is something to be aware of. These are just pointers. So in no way does the word primary repression indicate that it's only one emotion, because that's how the mind thinks of it. The mind thinks of it, things are everything's divided. But when you're pointing, you don't point to the mind, you point to experience. And the word repression here is pointing to the experience that certain emotions are more avoided or repressed held onto, buried, stored than other emotions because of how our families were, the environment that we grew up in, all that. So in my household, let's just say, for example, anger is not allowed. But in your household, everybody's angry and it's fine. Just don't show sadness. We're going to have different primary repressions when we grow up. I'm going to have anger as a primary, but there may be something else with it. It could be something else. It could be that I have to hold back sadness because I was bullied and I couldn't cry from the bullies. That's not really what happened. But you see, so it's not as simple as just there's just one emotion. We have to look at the whole spectrum of emotions to see what feels most unsafe for us. And as you do KI, you'll discover, you will discover what your primary, it's resistance, basically. What are the biggest shutdowns or the biggest no's when it comes to certain emotions? Okay. So when they ask me that, but sometimes, like recently, somebody asked me that. I said, let me just say it a different way. I said, the thing is, you can look at anger repression, whether it's a primary or not, is another thing. But if there's anger repression, look for the following things: is to be really straight up with you. It's like, okay, just come and shit on me. That's the anger repression programming. Come and shit on me. Say whatever you want to me. I'm not going to say anything back because keeping the peace is more important than for me being real. I need your love. I need the peace more than I need the safety more than that. Okay. So shit on me, obligate me, manipulate me, call me names, attack me. I'm not going to say anything. I will have no boundaries, violate the boundaries that I don't have, step all over me even. See, you can shit on me because I'm holding back anger. So look into your life and just see if there's a sort of an invitation that you're sending out to people by simply not speaking up and setting boundaries. It's not like you're sitting there going, hey, please, verbally, please shit on me. But by saying nothing, because you're holding yourself back, that's anger repression. By saying nothing, it's like you're inviting people to do that. So if you could just see that in your life, and if that's there, you don't have to guess. There is anger repression there. And so the question then is that a primary? You're going to know that as you go into KI, because as you go into like hurt, sadness, anger, you're probably going to notice if, for example, if anger is your primary, you're probably going to notice that you're not as scared to go into sadness, for example, in inquiry or even in life. Like, for example, if something upsetting happens, you're more comfortable with crying or feeling sad or down than you would about being angry about it. Even though there may be anger there, it's safer for you because of your conditioning. But let's just say someone represses sadness primarily. These are the things you have to look at. In their spiritual practice, when they get close to that grief or that sadness, they might just get fucking pissed for a moment. And that can look like an angry person almost. And if you see that in life or relationship, people with sadness as a primary can appear angry because that's a safer emotion for them. It could show up that way for you. And so it's deceptive because if anger keeps coming up, it can even make you think, or even you can even bamboozle yourself into thinking, well, I don't know if sadness is repressed then. Well, you can't know a repression because it's repressed. It's the thing that's behind everything, remember? So if you're going to try to discover your primary repression, almost the last thing you're going to want to do is feel into your body. Now, let me qualify that. It's repressed in your body. So when you feel into your body, if it's repressed or suppressed, it's not even going to feel like emotion quite often. There might be some tinge of emotion in there, but I want you instead to feel into your body and look for what's actually showing up here. What I'm saying is actually showing up in first dimension or in human bodies with regard to repression. In the body, it's chronic pain and contraction. Contractions, pain, certain sensations that persist, like just not feeling comfortable in your own skin is a way of feeling like I can't just be. Talk about presence. It's if you want to sit and just be in presence, if you've got a body that feels very contracted or tight, it's difficult. And it's not just because the sensation is uncomfortable, it's because there's strong programming in that. It's unconscious. See? So that's why I say start early with second and as quick as you can third dimension, because you're dealing with that from the beginning. So but that wouldn't feel like, so if it's for example sadness that's repressed and you're in a first dimension teaching or world and you feel into your heart area and you hear me talking about sadness repression and you go there's no sadness in there, then that's the bamboozling right there, because it's already repressed. It's not even in the form of the emotion anymore. See, it's our hardened bodies, basically. It's the feeling of separation in the body. Say it that way. So if any feeling of separation is potentially that. So the heart contraction as you come down there, for example, if you use skillful third dimension work and even some second dimension work for sure, you would see that that's actually repression and trauma programming embedded into that contraction. And the bamboozling again is because it has concretized into something else. Let's say it that way. It used to be either the emotion or the potential for an emotion, but that got frozen into the body. And now it shows up as that tight stomach or even a bad shoulder or bad back or something. I want to say right now, just as a qualifier, I am not saying that all disease is created by emotions. How would I possibly say that? The science isn't saying that. I'm simply saying what the science is saying, which is a great many forms of disease have as a major contributing factor some emotional issue, including repression, trauma. And there's ample research that many of the chronic pain conditions are coming from repression. Not all of them. For example, if you have a traumatic injury, the pain that you're feeling after that traumatic injury, even if it lingers for a while, is not really chronic. It may become chronic, but Dr. Sarno said that those kinds of injuries, like real traumatic injuries, that sometimes the chronic pain is not, or the ongoing pain is not actually repression. And I'm talking about like a car accident or something really traumatic. Okay, so sorry, I jumped around. But the point is because you might have chronic pain now, and you might not put two and two together. For example, resting in awareness, you might say, oh, I feel some pain. And then the bamboozling starts, and you might just start categorizing that as physical or having nothing to do with your path, or maybe it's just something that you ate. And of course, your diet is important. Of course, what I eat is important. And what I do is important, the environment, all that. But here, the bamboozling is around the emotional system. It's like the mind will categorize something as physical, even if it doesn't know that, because it's been programmed. We've been programmed, many of us, to just believe that. Some of us have woken up out of that idea that everything is physical because you feel something like that. And some of us are still in it. So if you're in that paradigm where you think because you feel something physical, it's physical, you might have to question that, because that's part of the bamboozling, if it's in fact emotional. My point, though, is remember when you're doing third dimension work, because I'm inviting people to start early. See, so I want to tell them this because you're going to start early, and you go feeling into the body and you'll miss the repression because you'll think I'm talking about actual emotion that you can feel. Okay, so that's when you finally get to third dimension. You're going to have to work up to that probably, because it's a skill and it takes the capacity. You have to develop the capacity to be with what we're bringing up even in second dimension before you can go to third dimension. Just in order so that it's safe enough for you to go deeper, basically, that you have the capacity for that. Okay, but what I'm saying though is when you start out in both dimensions here. Work your way to third dimension. Include shadow work early. And then I think you're not on the road to bypassing. I really don't think that's, you're not as bypassing as much. You're doing things in a different way than so many people did that I've seen come through. especially if you go to third dimension work fairly early, if your system can handle it, that's doing something totally new in spirituality to me. And I think that because that goes to the root, you're on the right track at the right time, meaning as soon as you can. Okay. Just going to see what else needs to be said here, what comes up. So many of you have been telling me lately that what I'm saying is resonating because you've been on the path a while and you've seen the system shut down around the big, scary stuff. The bypassing has happened. You've been in first dimension, many of you, and you've seen that you just need to go deeper. So I know there's so many more resonating around this. So, again, I'll just invite you into KI, the members area, because that's where we're doing this, all these dimensions together. But again, if for some reason you can't do KI or you can't come to the members area, I'm inviting all of you, actually, even out there in the public, to do this. Just because I care that much, even if you don't come to this work, I'm really encouraging everybody. I'm hoping that this map catches on more to help people because I just wish it would have been available. I feel like it should be public domain in a way or something like it. Because if that would have been floating around, if I would have seen that, I would have gone, oh, that explains a lot. Yeah, that explains a hell of a lot. And so much, I would have just not done so much. There's just so much of the spiritual stuff I would not have done. I would not have spent time in it, including a lot of just pointing to presence. Because here's the other thing I want to share with you real quick about this path that I'm proposing. I think, but I can't be sure until some of you really pick it up, is that there's just going to be less post-awakening bullshit for people. You're still going to have to feel a lot of really uncomfortable things when you include third dimension. But I think a lot of the, like, up to and including the dark night of the soul stuff is massive resistance to what is. And that's repression. Because what is it that we're resisting? And what is? What is? What is here? From presence, you actually start to see that it's that we're not resisting coffee cups and wallets and cars. And ultimately, we're resisting, we don't want to feel certain things. And experiences and cars and people and things make us feel things. So from the very beginning, I'm sorry, not from the very beginning. Once we start to awaken to our true nature, there can be post-awakening, it can get pretty funky for people who I think don't start out with a skillful practice that avoids bypassing. I've seen it through the years that, working with all those people through the years, I saw their path and I saw the shit that they had to go through. It was all over the place. Some people didn't have to deal with a bunch of shit. Many people did. And as I look back, if those people could have had the map, I can't imagine that they wouldn't. I can't imagine they wouldn't have suffered less. They would have suffered less and not had to go through all of that. But I can't know because this is new. And I'm interested in meeting some of you that are fairly new to the path who are really hearing this whole spiritual awakening thing from a trauma-informed perspective. And you're interested in something deeper than just what we've been through. Many of us have been through this. I'm telling you, I'm 53. There are people who are older than me. Some of us have been around for decades. Those of you who are coming in new, you don't know all this. You don't know about our path. And so that's another reason that I do these videos, to let you guys know. Because the promise of first dimension, you have to be careful with it. And I'm a first dimension teacher. So you have to be careful with what I say in first dimension. But you may not know, if you're just getting to the path, you may not know about all this stuff down here. See? And so you have to be careful, because if your teacher doesn't know, then nobody knows. Nobody knows. And that's the bypassing right there. because you're relying on somebody that you think knows or sees that. And that's how I repressed anger through and after non-dual awakening. That's how that can happen. Excuse me. So I said that the traditions generally, putting the East and West together, it's beautiful because if you look back at this trigger with the identity thing and the repression of trauma behind it, it's like the West came in and said, look, here's the thing missing there in the East. They didn't really say that, but that's what's happening. It's like we got the fact that there's this awareness in the East and this identity ego thing. But the West came in and said, you just missed one piece, which is this thing right here, that this programming and this trauma imprinting, repression, that's part of all that. So if you're starting out on the path, you don't have to start like 100 years ago, 200, 300 years ago, where we didn't understand all this. See, you have all this now. You could actually go, so you don't have to even believe me. If you're starting out on the path, go just study trauma, Bessel van der Kolk, Peter Levine. There's much of science. Just go Google the studies on trauma and emotional repression linked to disease and chronic pain. And that's the human suffering. It's also linked to mental health. So here you are in non-duality or awakening. You're trying to relieve suffering. That's the suffering right there. So learn about that suffering, how that works, and become informed about that suffering. Learn about your operating system from the beginning, that it's seeking safety. Don't get full of fancy ideas that you just have this impulse to be free and you're just sort of like going head on into freedom without resistance, because that's not how that programming works. But if you see it from the beginning, or if you've been on the path for a while, you can correct it at any time. See, any of you can just see yourself on the map and go include the next dimension, right? But you really have to see yourself on the map. So remember, I'm just going to leave you with this, guys. See yourself on this map. How do you know where you're at? Are you in a first dimension teaching or practice? Do you follow essentially or do essentially those first dimension practices? So that puts you there. That's first dimension. If you don't do any prompting up, if you don't do any inquiry at all, and I don't mean Raman is who am I? That's usually kind of first dimension. If you don't do any inquiry, then I want you just to look for these things in your life. And the depression is just an example. It's mental health issue that remains. So, of course, you can alleviate some of the effects of the suffering with first dimension. In fact, a lot of it can go quiet, but I want you to look for the things that don't. Look for the body contractions, the chronic pain, the mental health, physical health issue, shadows, triggers that remain despite whatever recognition or pointing or practice that you're doing there. That's all you have to do is just look for those things. Those visible, conscious landing points is what we call. And then that will take you into second dimension because you'll see that you're missing something right there. When you get to second dimension, that's a deeper practice in my view. It's really good to add to the first dimension. See, it's complementary. You don't abandon awareness and letting things be as they are. That's first dimension foundational. That's you bring that into. See, they're not different. They're all here. It just means awareness, first dimension, awareness, everything arising and falling to awareness, first dimension. Second dimension is not everything arises and falls to awareness. And we start to learn that that deficiency story, for example, doesn't arise unless we prompt it up, right? And I want you to look here as you start to do this deeper work. I want you to look for the landing points for safety that might show up here. First of all, any of these might continue on even as you do second dimension. And if they do, don't be alarmed. It just means that you haven't gotten here yet. So of course it's still producing those effects. Now you know. So look for that. Look for these issues continuing even as you go into second dimension. This is what happened for me. Chronic pain continued, among a couple of other things. But another thing is just look for different kinds of landing points here. Look at where you're first of all, just deficiency stories. So even that is safer than the repression. So wherever you're seeing deficiency stories, self-limiting beliefs, I want you to understand that differently now. That's really, don't think of it as the core suffering or the core programming. It's an effect of it, and it's coming from the trauma and the repression. So if you keep seeing it, again, anything that continues like that, it could be that you're missing something, right? So watch for that. And then watch for the fact, at least understand intellectually, even if you don't see it in your experience yet, because sometimes we don't see it until we go to third dimension, but understand at first that the identity that you're seeing in second dimension, again, has emotions that are safer than the primary repression. So as I'm explaining, the unlovable self, the anger was repressed. So the unlovable self identity to the nervous system feels safer, even though it hurts like hell. It feels safer than the rage or a terror down here. Just understand it intellectually, because if you don't, your system will bamboozle you around it, bypassing. So do the work around identity, definitely examine that. But if you keep looking at identity over and over again, but you're still experiencing suffering and triggers or pain or illness, or you're going to want to go deeper, in my view. And then also just look for the absence of the repression. So if you start to get a sense, for example, that you repress anger, I want you just to notice that when you're triggered, yeah, you might feel some anger, but that some other emotion feels safer and it's kind of your go-to. So you might be like me, more prone to feeling like wounded or hurt rather than angry, even in a situation where anger might feel healthy, for example. Look for the absence of the repression, but also the presence of safer emotions in awareness. Look for dissociation, shutdown. This is your system saying, we are not going to the repression. Shut down, freeze. Nope. That's your system is self-protecting you. It'll do it in the embodiment process. As you start to feel big energies, your mind, your unconscious mind-body connection will shut you right down. We have ways to help you move through those states and welcome and unthaw that or thaw out that energy and transcend that programming that's constantly shutting you down. And then look for the non-dual insights. Now, the insights themselves are beautiful. The seeing that there's no self, that's a real seeing. The seeing of no separation can be seen in first and second dimension. It just can't include the unconscious. You can't, because you don't know what's there. That's still unconscious, but to the extent that there's this seeing, it's because that unconscious will just feel like a sensation. It could for some people when they go deep into that realization or that recognition, when they see this, what they are, for example, directly, the awareness, it might just feel like a sensation at first. So easy to dismiss it as just this arising and just going back to the seeing, the non-dual insight. And then sometimes using the language of the non-dual to dismiss the body and to dismiss the topic of trauma and dismiss processing and dismiss people who process. And that's dangerous, because what is that that's doing that? Repression, fear. Why does it matter? Because look, some people have to process stuff in order even to recognize their presence, because their system is too hijacked by the trauma. So we have to be careful when we get into those deep states of realization. There's a different kind of complacency that can come up. And that's the last thing I want to say to you. What I experienced was a real sort of spiritual complacency, which was repression. And what I mean was there was a few uncomfortable sensations in my body before the chronic pain came up. But it was like, it wasn't a big deal. And just resting as awareness was just the sensation. But because I was not paying attention to repression, that sensation grew into very severe pain, really severe pain. See, so that's the problem here, is it's so deceptive. When you're not awake to the unconscious and what it can do to your system, it shocked me. And so this is why I tell people from the beginning, as soon as you can, start that third dimension work so that you don't get bitten in the ass years later, like I did, with something that just is not getting met. Something is not being met in your experience. That's the stuff that can lead to the bypassing or the disease or the pain or whatever. Or just, like, let's don't even talk about this as preventing something. Joy, as I think I said in the last video, this is where your joy is. If you're wondering where your joy is, I was too. Because there was great peace and certainly some element of joy in the first recognition. But with repression, my joy was hiding with the anger. And you can't maybe understand that. Maybe not with the mind. But the insight is this, is that it just didn't feel safe to be me as a kid. Certain aspects of me. So those aspects of me, once they're brought online, there's joy because that's me. It's all just very natural. And I'm not identified with the identity that can't feel that. He can't express that joy. But so there's some element of joy when you see, well, I'm not the identity. That's joyful. I'm not that. But that thing back there that's holding back emotion also has to hold back the energy of joy because you can't be yourself. So being yourself would be joyful, but you can't. So in some way you can't, so the joy can't show up, not fully. And also love and all that can get shut down with trauma and repression, the expression of love, like just being loving, affectionate, can be shut down. So there's where your joy is. In case you're wondering. Now, another thing I want to say is people might hear this and say, well, then are we just going to be identified with all this now? So we're going to bring these parts of ourselves online and now that's what I am? No. This is where we bamboozle ourselves. The parts of ourselves that we've made unconscious, remember, those repressions are connected to the identity. The false self comes up because we can't be ourselves. We're holding that back. So the false self is connected to the repression. So by bringing the parts of ourselves online, make those conscious, we don't have to identify with the false self anymore. Free. Presence embodied is what that is. So it's the same presence that everybody else is talking about in non-duality. But here it's embodied, energetically embodied, not just some initial recognition, but fully embodied. But if you don't have the direct experience of it, it might sound like, oh, we're just now identifying with the parts of ourselves. So people will say, now I'm just going to be an angry person. No, that's not what happens. The holding back of the anger created the false identity, the good, the spiritual, and was behind the negative identities, as I say. It's behind that. See that? So by bringing that into awareness, you don't need that anymore. That collapses with it. So your authentic self is really just presence with this individual expression of you that is not in trauma anymore, not repressing emotion for safety. And then therefore no false self has to come up. And the great thing about it is if some false self comes up, you know where to go now. We go to the repression and trauma. So we just it's cleaning things up, just cleaning things up. Yeah. It feels so good, you all, to finally have a way of inquiry that deals with the bypass. It just feels really good for all of us. It just feels good to me. This is the best stage of me being a teacher because the integrity of knowing that we have a modality that meets the bypassing, that meets the deepest suffering is I just feel so settled in that. so settled and so confident in that. It's not for everybody, but for those who are ready, you know what I'm talking about here. I know you do. I love you guys. Hang out with me. Come to the members area if you want.